In the forgotten town of Graybrook, people vanished without warning, each receiving a polite note signed, "Thank you for your time." When Detective Laura Hayes uncovered the remains of Margaret Ellis, Harold Boyd, and an unnamed drifter beneath the old freight yard, all clues pointed toward one man, Elias Turner, a quiet former signalman living alone in a decaying blue house by the tracks. What seemed like an ordinary recluse was something far darker, an obsessive collector who cataloged his victims with surgical precision. But just as the truth surfaced, Elias vanished, leaving only silence and a final note waiting on his table. It began like any other year in the town of Graybrook, a place most people only drove through on their way to somewhere else. The air always smelled faintly of oil and rust, the remains of the factories that had once kept the town alive. Now only the hollow shells of those buildings stood, their windows cracked, their walls echoing with the whistle of the wind. The locals lived quiet, routine lives, and no one paid much attention to strangers. That's why at first no one noticed when people started to disappear. The first was a mechanic named Harold Boyd. He worked at the corner garage, a man known for never missing a day. One morning the shop door stayed closed. His coworkers thought he had overslept, maybe gone fishing. By evening, his wife called the police and a missing person report was filed. A week later, the case was quietly dropped after there were no signs of foul play. Then came Margaret Ellis, a school teacher who walked home every evening along the same route. Her bag was found neatly placed on a park bench. Her keys, wallet, and papers were all inside. Her phone lay beside it, battery dead, screen cracked. Next, it was a drifter who often slept near the bus station. Nobody knew his name. The station clerk remembered him waiting for a bus that never arrived. When police checked the security footage, the man was there 1 minute and gone the next. The tape had glitched for 22 seconds, and when the feed returned, his seat was empty. Each of these disappearances was treated as unrelated. Graybrook's police force was small and underfunded, its officers stretched thin. The missing files gathered dust on a metal shelf in the basement of the station. It seemed easier to assume these people had simply left town, moved on, or met misfortune elsewhere. There was no panic, no urgency, no connection made between the names. But a few locals noticed something strange. A grocery clerk sorting mail for delivery saw a pattern. Each person who vanished had received a small envelope a few days before they disappeared. The envelopes were cream-colored, hand-addressed, sealed with red wax. The handwriting was precise, almost old-fashioned. Inside there was only a single line written in blue ink. "Thank you for your time." No threats, no demands, no explanation. No one knew who sent them or what they meant. The letters felt too polite to be sinister, yet everyone who received one was gone within a week. Soon, the letters stopped arriving, and the talk around town faded like a rumor that had run out of breath. Graybrook went back to its silence. The trains still passed through at night, their horns echoing across the empty lots. But beneath that quiet surface, something was moving, something methodical and patient, waiting for the next name to write on a note, the next person to thank. And no one, not even the police, realized how close the truth already was. The house stood near the end of a forgotten lane, close enough to the railway tracks that the windows rattled each time a freight train passed. The paint had peeled to a dull, tired blue, and the curtains were always drawn even during the day. To anyone walking by, it looked like a house abandoned long ago, but every night a faint yellow light flickered behind those curtains, proof that someone was still living inside, that someone was Elias Turner. He had worked for the railway for over 30 years before he retired. People said he used to be one of the signalmen, the ones who stayed in the control booth by the tracks and switched the lines when trains came through. It was a lonely job, and most thought Elias had stayed in it too long. He lived alone now, a thin, gray man who moved slowly and spoke little. The neighbors saw him sometimes feeding stray cats or sweeping his porch in silence. When they greeted him, he nodded once without a word and went back inside. Elias kept to himself. The postman rarely had mail for him except for the occasional parcel of mechanical parts. Delivery drivers said he always asked them to leave the boxes on the porch and never opened the door until they were gone. Children dared each other to knock on his door, but none stayed long enough to see if he answered. Some said they heard faint drilling sounds coming from his basement at night, followed by the metallic tapping of tools. Others said they saw him carrying heavy bags out to the yard long after midnight. The few who spoke with him said Elias had an odd calm about him, a kind of stillness that made people uneasy. He wasn't unkind, but there was something distant in his eyes, as though he was watching something only he could see. His property was neat, too neat for an old man living alone. Every blade of grass trimmed evenly, every window washed spotless. The orderliness of it all didn't match the decay of the rest of the neighborhood. When a local boy once peeked through a side window, he claimed to have seen glass jars lined on a shelf, filled with dark liquid. The boy told his friends, who laughed and said Elias was just a collector, maybe of old tools or machine parts, but no one ever went close again. People in Graybrook didn't like to interfere in others' lives. They whispered, speculated, then carried on as if nothing was wrong. Elias Turner remained the quiet man by the tracks, invisible but always there. The police never thought to question him about the missing people. Why would they? He had lived there for decades without trouble. And so the house remained silent, the sound of the trains covering whatever went on inside. Behind those blackout curtains, Elias worked alone, carefully and methodically, the way he once had on the rail lines, only now, the signals he followed belonged to something darker, and no one could see where they led. The storm that broke over Graybrook that night was the worst anyone could remember in years. Rain came down in hard slanting sheets, washing the streets clean of dust and memory. The river swelled past its banks, dragging branches and debris downstream. By morning, several roads were blocked and the drainage system beneath the town began to overflow. Workers were called out before dawn to clear the tunnels that ran under the freight yard. Long, damp corridors that hadn't been inspected in years. One of them, a man named Curtis Heller, climbed down into the largest drain with a flashlight strapped to his helmet. The beam of light cut through the darkness and stopped on something large wedged in the grating ahead. He thought at first it was a bundle of rags or an animal washed in by the flood. But when he pulled the object closer, the plastic tore and something pale pressed against the light. A human hand. The skin was waterlogged, the fingers curled tightly, a ring still on one of them. Curtis dropped his tool and stumbled back, shouting for help. The police cordoned off the area within an hour. Investigators in raincoats waded through the tunnel, lifting out the remains carefully. The discovery shook Graybrook awake. For years, the missing people had been names on forgotten papers. Now they had become something solid, undeniable. Forensics confirmed that the hand belonged to Margaret Ellis, the schoolteacher who had vanished 3 years earlier. Further searching revealed more. Beneath layers of mud and broken pipes, officers uncovered several plastic-wrapped bundles buried in the soil. When they opened them, they found human remains, 3, then 4, each placed carefully as if arranged by someone meticulous. The bodies were not dumped in haste. They had been positioned neatly side by side, their faces covered, their hands folded over their chests. Every package was sealed with heavy plastic tape and labeled with a small paper tag tied to the wrist. Each tag had a single word written in blue ink: returned. The word puzzled everyone. Returned from where? Returned to whom? The local police called in state investigators, and the freight yard became a crime scene, swarming with uniforms and flashing lights. The smell of antiseptic lingered in the air, faint but distinct, like something used in hospitals or funeral homes. News spread quickly. Reporters arrived, and Graybrook's quiet streets filled with cameras and questions. People speculated about cults, about revenge, about secret graves from decades past, but the evidence didn't fit any theory. The victims came from different backgrounds, had nothing in common, and had disappeared over many years. The one thing connecting them was the careful way they were handled, as if the person responsible didn't see them as victims but as something to preserve. When detectives reviewed the map, they noticed something else. All the burial sites circled the same location, forming a loose ring around the old freight yard, and at the very center of that ring stood the small blue house with the blackout curtains, where Elias Turner still lived quietly, feeding the stray cats that waited on his porch. When police finally entered the blue house by the tracks, the air inside was still and cold, as if the building itself had been holding its breath. The curtains were drawn tight, shutting out the gray morning light. Dust didn't hang in the air the way it should have. The place was spotless, unnaturally so. Every surface gleamed. The furniture was arranged neatly, the floors freshly mopped. Nothing looked abandoned or chaotic. It was as if someone had prepared the house for guests, expecting company that never came. The search began room by room. Officers found nothing unusual on the ground floor. No photographs, no personal mementos, nothing to suggest who Elias Turner had been beyond his name. His kitchen cupboards were filled with cans of food organized by type and date. The refrigerator was empty except for a bottle of water and a half-used jar of cleaning solvent. On the table sat a folded cloth, a set of gloves, and a small glass jar half full of clear liquid. The faint sterile smell that had lingered in the freight yard was stronger here. The real discovery came when they forced open the door to the basement. The first thing they noticed was the noise, a low hum from an old ventilation fan running continuously, keeping the air cool. The walls were lined with shelves built from heavy timber, each shelf holding rows of glass jars. Some were filled with cloudy liquid. Others contained small preserved items, teeth, locks of hair, bits of jewelry, coins, buttons. The jars were labeled neatly in blue ink, each with a name and a date. In the center of the basement stood a long wooden table, scarred and dark from use. Above it hung a single bulb, its light revealing tools laid out in perfect order: saws, scalpels, clamps, rolls of plastic sheeting. None of it was rusted. Everything had been cleaned and oiled. On the far wall, detectives found a large corkboard covered in maps of Graybrook. Red pins marked locations across the town. Lines drawn between them formed a pattern, a kind of web radiating outward from the freight yard. Then came the ledger. It sat on the table beneath the light, bound in black leather and titled the Courtesy List. Inside were pages of names, written in the same careful handwriting seen on the victims' tags and letters. Each entry noted a date, an occupation, and a brief description of where the person was last seen. Every line ended with the same phrase, "Collection complete." The deeper the investigators read, the more horrifying it became. The ledger went back over 20 years. Dozens of victims. Each entry matched a missing persons report once dismissed as unsolved or abandoned. Elias Turner had been documenting his crimes as if maintaining a professional record. There were no signs of rage or chaos, just precision, ritual, and politeness. When questioned later, one detective said the basement didn't feel like a killer's lair. It felt like a workspace, a place of calm purpose. Everything there suggested Elias Turner didn't see his victims as people to harm, but as specimens to preserve, to organize, to return to the earth in his own controlled way. And though the evidence filled the room, one thing was missing: Elias himself. His chair was empty. His tools were in their place. It was as if he had simply stepped out, planning to come back unaware that his secrets had finally been unearthed. The day the police returned to arrest Elias Turner, the sky was a pale, colorless gray. The house by the tracks looked the same as always, quiet still, the curtains drawn. 2 patrol cars waited outside while detectives approached the door. They knocked once, then again. No sound came from within. The third knock was met with silence, and so they forced the lock and stepped inside. The first thing they noticed was the smell. The sharp, sterile scent that had once filled the basement was gone. In its place was the faint odor of dust and rain. Everything in the house remained perfectly arranged, untouched since the search days earlier. The jar on the kitchen table was still there, but the gloves and cloth were gone. Upstairs, the bed was neatly made, clothes folded, no sign of struggle or departure. His wallet, identification, and keys lay on the nightstand. The lights were off, but the basement door was open and a thin strip of illumination glowed beneath it. When they went down, the fan still hummed softly. The shelves of jars stood as they had before, the ledger open on the table. But this time there was something new. A note had been placed neatly beside the book, written in the same careful blue handwriting. It read, "Thank you for your time," nothing more. There was no trace of Elias Turner anywhere on the property. The doors had been locked from the inside and the windows sealed. No footprints in the mud outside, no tire tracks, no witnesses who saw anyone leave. It was as if the man had vanished into thin air. Search teams combed every inch of the freight yard and the tunnels beneath it. They drained sections of the river, searched abandoned train cars, and even brought in dogs. The scent trails led nowhere. Not a single clue suggested where he had gone, or how he had left. Some believed he had taken his own life somewhere the water would carry him away. Others thought he had escaped through the old railway tunnels which stretched for miles and connected to forgotten routes long closed to the public. Weeks passed, then months. The case became national news for a while until interest faded and newer stories took its place. Graybrook slowly returned to its silence, though it never felt the same again. People avoided the freight yard. Children crossed the street rather than walk past the blue house even after it was boarded up. The wind that passed through the empty tracks seemed to carry whispers, faint and rhythmic like the ticking of a clock. Years later, when similar disappearances began hundreds of miles away, detectives couldn't ignore the details. The victims were unrelated, found wrapped carefully in plastic, marked with the same blue ink, the same single word, returned. None of the evidence linked directly to Elias Turner, yet the precision, the method, the unsettling politeness were all too familiar. No one ever proved he was alive. No one ever found his body. But those who worked the case swore that whenever a storm rolled through Graybrook, the drains still gave off that same faint smell of antiseptic. And sometimes, late at night, the old rail line signal lights would flicker on by themselves, shining against the blue house's boarded windows, as though someone, somewhere, was still keeping watch.